A special election in Georgia goes Republican, and President Trump celebrates on Twitter. After all the fuss about the Georgia 6th, what's the outlook for next year's midterms? Craig Gilbert will talk about that through the prism of Paul Ryan's district. Back in Wisconsin, we discuss a controversial verdict involving a former Milwaukee police officer. And we learned this week that the U.S. Supreme Court will take up a Wisconsin case on redistricting, which could end in a landmark decision. What could this case mean for American politics? Patrick Marley discusses. We'll have all that and more today from the best political team in Wisconsin on OnPolitics. I'm David Haynes. I'm the opinions editor at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. Welcome to OnPolitics for this Thursday afternoon. Well, there was more news out of Washington this morning, and let's go straight to Craig Gilbert of our Washington Bureau to talk about that. Joined by Craig Gilbert now. And Craig, some breaking news out of Washington this morning with the Senate Republicans unveiling their health care overhaul, the repeal of Obamacare. What do we know about it so far?
Well, we're just starting to get a look at the bill. I mean, we knew even before today that this was not going to be a wholesale rewrite of the House bill like we once thought it would be, that it's more of sort of changes along the margins. It's going to be a little bit more moderate than the House bill in some respects, perhaps with respect to the subsidies people get for Obamacare, but it's going to follow the broad outlines of the House bill with all of its controversy and all of the political complications, which are especially striking in the Senate, where Republicans have a very narrow majority and they have to thread the needle between the moderate people with the moderates with reservations about the bill and the hardcore conservatives with reservations about the bill.
Right. It's a political gamble for McConnell. This was developed in secrecy, and they got a fair amount of heat even from their own party for that. But he has to get to, he can lose 3 senators, right?
Right.
No, he can lose.
I mean, there's two issues
Yeah.
with the process. I mean, one is the secrecy, which you talked about, which has been very notable. And it's also just the time frame. Republicans drafted their own bill without Democrats. They say, well, Democrats weren't going to help us anyway. But then they're leaving essentially about a week for people to kind of digest, absorb, and explain the bill before the Senate is going to have to vote on it. That makes even some Republicans nervous. Ron Johnson, the Republican from Wisconsin, who's expected to support the bill in the end by most people, had said yesterday that he didn't think that was enough time for people to evaluate the bill and to kind of get input from their own constituents on the bill.
Isn't there a risk for the Republicans here, too, of sort of owning the health care debate, much as Democrats did?
Yeah, I mean, that is a risk regardless of what's in the bill. I think that's just part of what they inherited when they took power. I think they understand that, and they're kind of caught in a little bit of a political vice between passing a very unpopular bill, as all the polling suggests the House bill was, and this isn't going to be too different from the House bill, and not passing a bill which would have the effect of angering and demoralizing their own political base. So they face political risks both ways, but they're making the judgment that the bigger political risk for them is not doing anything and depressing their base going into the midterm elections.
So speaking of the midterms, there was a big race down in Georgia this week. Democrats thought they had a chance to win it. They didn't. How do you read that race? And then talk a little bit about a piece you're working on that sort of looks at the midterms through Paul Ryan's district.
Yeah, so there's mixed takeaways for the parties in that Georgia race. I mean, it was a very Republican seat, even though Donald Trump, narrowly lost the district to Hillary Clinton. So for Democrats, there have been a series of special elections on pretty Republican turf, and they haven't won any of them, which is obviously not good, but they've come really close. And so for Democrats, they can take some solace in the fact they are outperforming their historical levels in these Republican districts, even though they're not winning these districts. And for Republicans, I mean, they know how to win on Republican turf, and in a very polarized world, that may be enough for them to defend some districts, even where Trump isn't particularly popular, if they can get their base to turn out for partisan reasons for their party. And now we have the House Speaker, Paul Ryan, who's in charge of defending the Republican House majority. He's got a Democratic opponent, a union worker in his own district. It's pretty clear that Democrats are going to put more effort into the Ryan race than they've made in the past. And his race is going to reflect some of these national dynamics. It's a really interesting district. It's a Republican district, but it contains some Democratic cities, and it kind of contains a lot of the political dynamics we've seen play out on the broader stage of Republican small towns that were very pro-Trump, Republican suburbs that are where Trump actually underperformed, and Democratic cities that didn't perform as well for Hillary Clinton as they should. It'll be really interesting to watch how those communities react in the midterms and in the next presidential cycle.
So let's go back to the Georgia 6 just for a moment. In that race, the Democrat John Ossoff, a 30-year-old political, at least in terms of running a race neophyte, was really tied by the Republicans to Nancy Pelosi over and over again in campaign advertising. Afterwards, some who were critical of her to begin with were saying maybe it's time for a new generation of leadership in the Democratic Party. Is there any chance that could actually happen?
Well, probably not in the very short run. Obviously, eventually it will. This has been kind of a long-running debate within the Democratic Party, and it's not going away based on the reaction to the Georgia race. So, you know, the effect of having kind of Nancy Pelosi at the top of the Democratic Party in Congress is going to vary from district to district. In Republican districts, she's a very effective target, probably less so in more purple districts. But again, this is sort of one pathway forward for Republicans. They're going to be defending their majority on mostly Republican turf, and this is going to be one of their formulas for doing that.
All right, Craig Gilbert in Washington, thanks so much. Now I'm back in our Milwaukee studio with James Causey. James, a columnist for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. And James, we had a major case decided yesterday. Dominique Heaggan-Brown, former Milwaukee police officer who shot a Milwaukee man, an African-American man, which ended up being the trigger for some unrest in the community last year, was found not guilty by a jury yesterday. Were you surprised by that verdict?
No. And I believe a lot of African Americans were not surprised. I mean, when you saw the videotape,
the body cam,
you realize that, you know, everything happened so quick, you know, from the time that he got out of the car and ran to the time that the shooting took place, was roughly, 11, 12 seconds. Mm-hmm. But regardless of any kind of body cam, any kind of film, any kind of videotape, anything, you never hardly ever get a conviction of a police officer. It just doesn't happen, not here. Mm-hmm. Not anywhere in this country.
Well, we had the case up in the Twin Cities in Minneapolis.
Yeah, this comes right on the heels of the Philando Castile case just last week, mm-hmm. Where, you know, we saw in that instance where the officer fired 7 shots into a car on Philando Castile, a guy who worked in the public school system there. A guy who said he was stopped by police 49 times in his life. Can you imagine that? 49 times being stopped. And this officer fired shots in the car because he said, I have a gun, I have my concealed carry permit, and they had, you know, a couple of words passed, and next thing you know, this guy, the officer, fired 7 shots into the car, which had a 4-year-old in the back seat and another woman in the car. And we know a lot about that because right after the shooting, Philando Castile's girlfriend went to Facebook Live, and we actually saw him die on camera. And it's just the power of all these devices and that you get to see this stuff happen. It happens all the time. I don't think the conversation is really about officers getting off all the time, because we know that happens. And we're starting to see this more often because of phones and everybody has technology. Yeah. I think the conversation needs to be had on what needs to take place to get a conviction. I mean, we don't know what it takes. I mean, a guy says, I have a concealed carry permit, I have a gun, and you go to take the gun out and then you're killed. You have a case with Tamir Rice, who had a toy gun in a park, a 12-year-old.
In Cleveland, a couple of years ago.
Yeah, he's walking in this park, and the officer pulls up, a squad pulls up and fires 3 shots on this kid within 0.2 seconds or something like that. You have this case where...
now in this case, the officer, they were in pursuit of the victim. The officer fires 1 shot, which the DA agreed was defensible.
Right.
Seville Smith had a gun, and then he threw the gun over a fence, and then at that point the second shot was fired.
Right.
But you were saying earlier it might have been hard for the jury to convict because things happen so quickly.
Things happen so quickly, and because the way that what you're presented with, it's almost like, what was this man's intent? What was the officer's intent? Was his intent to kill, or was he really scared? And I don't know. These officers always say that they're scared and they fear for their life. Going back to Philando Castile, he said that the smell of marijuana coming from the car with the baby in the back seat caused him to fear for his life, because if someone was smoking marijuana in this car, it's obviously that they didn't have any care for this child, so it's obviously that they wouldn't have any care for his life. So that put him on edge to the point that he feared for his life. It's like, it's almost hard to argue if a person is fearful of their life or not, and that makes it impossible to almost get a conviction.
So how's the community reacted so far?
Well, last night I was impressed. There was no violence in Sherman Park, but
and the family was careful to call on the community to react peacefully.
Yeah, I expected that, and I don't think we have the stomach or the energy to go through what we went through again last year. That was very stressful, and a lot of people are still dealing with the impact of that. So, I'm happy that the family is taking, they're not going to stop, and they shouldn't. And now they're going to try to see if they could get some kind of financial compensation for what happened to their loved one.
Civil suits, so that case at least will continue.
Yeah, but no amount of money could bring a Seville Smith back, and no amount of money could take that sting that was left on Milwaukee last year during the riots.
All right, James Causey, thanks so much.
Thanks.
Now next we want to go to Patrick Marley in Madison for a discussion about the redistricting case that the U.S. Supreme Court took up earlier this week, and a look ahead at what's left to do on the state budget. Well, Patrick, there was a big decision by the U.S. Supreme Court this week to take a case from Wisconsin that involves the redistricting of the state back in 2011. What are the national implications of that case potentially?
Yeah, this case could be really big for all states, not just Wisconsin. The question before the court is, can a political party go too far in drawing legislative and congressional districts in that they gerrymander them so much to benefit their party that they violate the voting rights of the other party? And in Wisconsin, Republicans control, as they do in many states right now. They were able to draw these maps. They're very helpful to them. But if the Democrats who have won at the lower court level succeed before the U.S. Supreme Court, that would set a new standard for drawing maps nationwide, and both Republicans and Democrats could challenge existing maps state by state.
Right. And I don't think the Supreme Court has ever ruled on whether maps could be so partisan that they're illegal, essentially.
That's right. The court has, ruled a lot on. There's been a lot of redistricting case law on things like, racial minorities, but they have always had trouble struggling with this issue of partisanship. Some of the justices say, look, this is something that's completely in the political sphere. Courts can't figure this out. They can't manage this. It's just to leave it to the politicians. Others, the more liberal justices, have said, no, there can be a standard. There should be a standard that we can measure when it goes too far. And sitting in the middle is Anthony Kennedy, who has said he has not yet seen a standard that he trusts to measure this, but that he does believe that it can go too far. So this tests a new theory. Really, everybody should be watching Anthony Kennedy. He could say, aha, we found the measurement for this. Or he could say, we've been looking for decades for what that measurement might be. Maybe it's just not there, and we do leave this completely to the political bodies and not to the courts.
Well, arguments to come on that when the court begins its new term this fall. Let's shift to the state budget. Republicans, as you mentioned, control the entire state government, the Assembly, the Senate, and the governor's office. And yet they're unlikely to meet the June 30th sort of deadline for getting a state budget together. What are the main stumbling blocks left to overcome?
Yeah, so I'd say transportation remains the most serious one. They are differing, the Senate and the Assembly, on education right now as well. But I talked to John Nygren today, who's the leader for the Assembly of the Joint Finance Committee. He says, as did Robin Vos, the Speaker, that they believe that they can reach a deal as early as next week on education, that they're starting to make some headway there. But they both said that transportation remains very elusive, and they pretty openly acknowledge they're not going to meet the June 30th deadline. I think the question is, how much past that deadline do we go? If it's only a short period of time, it's really not a very serious problem at all for the state. If it stretches out into the fall, then it really complicates road projects, for one thing, and it becomes perhaps more of an image issue for Republicans as they try to explain to the public how they are unable to pass a budget even though they control all the state government.
Is there anything the legislature needs to do to make sure the state stays in business in the interim, or does the old budget, the current budget, simply continue?
Right. So very, very different than the federal budget. They're very different than many states. I should say very different from many states which shut down if they don't have a budget. Here in Wisconsin, the old budget just continues at the current funding levels, and so the state can continue on doing most of what it does. It gets tricky for things like transportation because there'd be no new authority to do any borrowing. So some projects eventually could face delays, but on July 1, it's not like you can't go to the DMV or something. Right. Things are pretty status quo for
not that
at least
I would
for the summer.
ever want to have to go to the DMV. But, at any rate,
the
thanks so much.
last time I had to renew my license, it wasn't as bad as you think it would be.
No, actually, DMV in Wisconsin is very good compared to other states I've lived in. Patrick Marley, thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
I'm back with Mary Spicuzza, reporter for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, and Dan Bice, a columnist for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. And it's once again time for our favorite
winners, losers
segment of the week, winners and losers. Mary, let me go to you first. Who's your winner this week?
I'm going to say Diamond Inn Motel. So this is a motel that has had repeated problems with reports of drug dealing, reports of human trafficking, specifically a lot of police reports involving child sex trafficking issues. Previously, a Common Council committee had voted unanimously to shut it down, to not renew its license. There's a lot of outcry from the community saying that they had seen prostitutes performing sex acts in the parking lot, drug overdoses. The Common Council reversed course this week and decided to give them their license back, renew it with a 90-day suspension, and they did set up some kind of security measures they have to take. They're getting like a new fence and a new gate and more security officers, and I guess they're going to do a roundtable with hotel owners to talk about preventing child sex trafficking and sex trafficking in general. But to go from being shut down to just being closed down for 90 days, I'm going to say that was probably a win, and some would say an unexpected win for them.
All right, so a relatively low bar for the
At one point, the attorney in a follow-up interview did say that it wasn't as big of a problem as it had been made out to be, and he believed on any given weekend night there were no more than 3 rooms that were occupied by a prostitute, which I don't know how many rooms they have, but 3 seems like that would be a concern if there are actually 3 rooms.
That would seem to be. All right, who's your loser?
I'm going to say our own sheriff, who will, at least for the time being, remain our sheriff, David A. Clark Jr., who announced on Saturday that he was withdrawing pulling his name out of the hat for his huge pay raise and promotion to go work for the Trump administration. There were a lot of questions about whether it had actually been withdrawn, and he was just being allowed to save face because after there's been these ongoing investigations with the jail, and as Bice and others reported, there were also a lot of questions about plagiarism on his master's thesis out in California.
So we wrote last Friday that it had been a month since he announced he was going to take a position in the Trump administration, and now we know there was a tentative job offer, is the language that the Trump administration has used.
With a significant pay raise.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. I mean, except for he does make a lot of money on the side. But it was a 35% pay increase. And from what I understand, there was an actual start date for him. June 12th was supposed to be the start date, but things were very slow in the administration. And we're still not clear on why he pulled his name, why he decided not to take the position. In his statement, which was like 4 paragraphs long, he doesn't ever say why he decided not to do it. And then
did he decide? Is there any indication the administration had got cold feet?
I mean, his statement says he rescinded his acceptance, which is sort of a weird way to say it. I don't think we have any indication right now that the Trump administration pulled it, but the whole thing has been weird. So it's not really. I mean, the Trump administration never said that they offered it to him. The Department of Homeland Security never said that he had the position. They only put out a statement on Saturday or Sunday saying he's no longer under consideration, and that's the first reference that they've made to him. So the question is, what happens to him now? And he put out a statement. Chris Abley put out a statement asking him to resign, and he responded by saying, "I'm going to be around until January of 2019, at least until January of 2019," which would imply he's here for the entire administration. But those around him were saying, no, that might not be the case. So,
so there might be another job.
Well, his statement said that he's looking at taking something either inside the government or outside government. So I have no idea right now.
I think, News host, maybe.
I think we don't know. I mean, do you trust his statement that says he's going to be around for the full term? I understand he's not terribly interested in running for office again. So I think, as with everything with Sheriff Clark, we just don't know what's exactly going through his head right now.
I guess maybe when you get a job offer, you should hold your horses and maybe let the let the employer announce that, or let them sign off on it. Yeah.
All right. So Dan, who's your loser of the week?
It's the Wisconsin Supreme Court. They just made a decision to close more of their hearings to the public, like any other court. Their deliberations are in private, their arguments are held in public, but they took a step a few years back to open up their administrative meetings, and the court's now ruled 5-2 to close those administrative meetings to the public. So and the Supreme Court doesn't have a great record on openness, open meetings, open records, so this is another step in that direction.
All right. And your winner?
Erin Hills, where they had the U.S. Open golf tournament just recently. It got off on a little bit of a rocky foot with the blimp going down, the 94-year-old man who died, but in the end, everybody seemed to, be singing its praises and are already talking about coming back again.
Of course, got great reviews, except for Thomas Boswell at the Washington Post, who didn't like it, but everyone else I read gave it good reviews.
Yeah. So.
All right. So let's take a question or two. We have one from Marlene who asks, I'll paraphrase here, but in the wake of Dominique Heaggan-Brown being found not guilty, what are the chances that there will be riots or unrest in the city? Of course, that his shooting of Seville Smith sparked the Sherman Park episode last summer. Mm-hmm. Mary, do you want to?
I think that the family was very impressive in the speed with which they called for a peaceful response and urged people not to respond violently. The mayor also quickly called for, said he supported free speech and protests, but called for peace. I think that probably the family, has had a effect and kind of soothing things. We'll see this weekend whether that continues. I know they staffed up in Sherman Park and probably will throughout the weekend, but I think everyone will want to keep an eye on what happens this weekend as more people are out and about.
Well, this one's related from a viewer who calls himself or herself True Blue, wonders, with all the shootings by Milwaukee police and now the Milwaukee County Sheriff, why would anyone want to be an officer? Because every time there's a shooting, there are always questions, hearings, and investigations into the officer's past life.
So why would you want to be a cop?
Why would you want to be a cop?
Yeah, but actually, in terms of the number of cops who've been charged and convicted in Milwaukee County, it's not a very high number. So I don't think I don't understand why someone would object to, when there's a shooting, to go in and to conduct an investigation to find out what happened. I think that's a turn for the good, the fact that we scrutinize these things.
Well, now
and
they're
this officer wasn't even fired for this incident. He was fired for, as the unrest was happening, he's accused of raping somebody or sexual assault, and was kind of like, the victim said he was like almost bragging about how he could get away with anything as he was watching unrest on the TV. So he was not fired for this incident, and Officer Manny, who was involved in the Dontre Hamilton shooting in Red Arrow Park, he was actually not fired for the shooting. He was fired for the pat down and like an out of policy pat down. So it's not only have they not been convicted, but most of them have actually been fired for other, or at least last two were fired for other reasons.
We should point out the recent shooting involving the sheriff's deputy is being investigated by the Waukesha County Sheriff's Office, which is now protocol.
Outside agency.
Yeah, an outside agency. All right. Well, we'll leave it there. Thanks so much for viewing our show today. Also, thanks to Craig Gilbert in Washington, Patrick Marley, James Causey, and Dan Bice and Mary Spacuzza. Thanks for joining us.